Hello and greetings from UB. On behalf of the Office of Alumni Engagement and the UB School of Management, we are delighted you are able to join us for today's webinar presentation. My name is Christy Fields and I manage the Alumni Careers and Lifelong Learning Program here at UB. I am also joined by my wonderful colleague Joy Rona, who will be assisting me in monitoring any questions that you might have during today's presentation. We are both so grateful you are able to join us today, and we hope you and your family are staying well. It is my honor to welcome today's featured presenter, Professor Natalie Simpson. Natalie is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Operations Management and Strategy in the UB School of Management. Her research in supply chains and emergency services appears in journals, including the Journal of Operations Management, the Journal of the Operational Research Society, and the European Journal of Operational Research. Natalie received a BFA from the University of North Carolina of the Arts and both an MBA and PhD from the University of Florida. Her teaching interests include operations management and analytics, and she has earned numerous distinctions for instruction, including the SUNY Chancellor's Award for Teaching Excellence and the Production and Operations Management Society's Wickman Skinner Award. She currently serves as a director on the board of the Decision Sciences Institute. In today's session, Natalie will navigate the new world that we're living in and examine the successful practices of professionals and organizations that routinely operate under disruption. We are going to leave some time during today's webinar for Q&A. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them through your GoToWebinar taskbar. You're going to see a question box on your screen, and you can chat those questions to us at any time. And then in addition, we are going to record today's session, and we will send you all a copy within the next 24 hours. So with that said, it's my pleasure to turn it over to a colleague of mine here at UB in the UB School of Management, Professor Natalie Simpson.
Well, thank you, Christy, and thank you, everybody, for attending. I'm Natalie Simpson, and we're going to look at when you're not in Kansas anymore. The opening here, I feel like I should give you some context, and this might seem initially a little self-indulgent, but a little bit about me. This is a me in that photo right there, although actually this photo was taken more years ago than I care to admit. I joined a volunteer fire department some years ago while on the faculty of the University of Buffalo, and I'm smiling because that's not actually an emergency that I'm at. I want to clarify that. There's a photo from the same event. That's what's known as a controlled burn. I would not be grinning if somebody were accidentally losing their property. Now, I joined this fire department a long time ago. I wanted to give back to my community. As Christy was telling you, my field is operations management. I teach in a business school. My initial training and research was in commercial supply chains, and this is a more age-appropriate photo of me. I became interested in emergency response after I joined the fire department, and through the years that's now become my main passion in research. My focus in my research has shifted. Now, a lot of my colleagues have assumed that my interest in the fire department, right here being involved in working with fire departments is, since I'm a professor over here in a business school, I must be like helping them be more business-like, learning how to be more efficient. And certainly there's been a little bit of that through the years. If I can help that way, I do. But that's not actually my fascination with emergency response. And that's not actually the focus of my research. The focus of my research is trying to distill and convince the business world that there's a lot that you can learn from emergency response organizations. There's a lot that you can learn about managing and succeeding in bad, disrupted conditions, because they do that all of the time. So that's the genesis of today's discussion. Here in the agenda, I feel like just up front, although I think maybe you can guess, I should clarify why is there a reference to Kansas in the title of this talk. And then we should talk next about two things that need to go well in succession, the first step and the next step in an emergency in order for us to perhaps triumph in the end. Now, right here, while we're looking at the agenda, another clarification. I know I was just showing you pictures of me and fire here at a fire. So when I say emergency, you might be thinking that's exactly what I'm talking about. Emergencies like structure fires and auto accidents. Certainly that could be the emergency. But throughout this talk, I'm actually referring to an emergency in the broadest sense. An emergency is an unexpected occurrence that requires immediate attention, your immediate attention. We are all actually living in an emergency right now. Now, having talked about the first thing that you should do in an emergency and the second thing that you should do in any type of emergency, then we'll get down to the meat of it, right? From my observations and from some other people's research. I'm going to draw in some other studies. What are the principles of actually being successful in the midst of a disruption? So to the top of the list, why Kansas, right? Kansas, the sunflower state. Kansas, embedded in the middle of North America there. I think you probably can guess what that was a reference to. When you're not in Kansas anymore, I was paraphrasing what is widely considered one of the best known movie quotes of all time. And it's from the fantasy musical adventure, The Wizard of Oz, released in 1939. This is just a clipping of YouTube of the exact moment that the line is uttered. It's spoken by the character Dorothy Vale in the center of that picture. She's speaking to her canine companion. The line is often paraphrased, but the exact line is, "Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore." Now, how is this relevant to, like, for instance, us and what we're going through right now? Okay, Dorothy starts out in that movie, if you think about the story arc, in Kansas. And at that point in the movie is monochrome. It's actually not strictly black and white, it's sepia toned. Then, unexpectedly, a tornado transports her to the land of Oz, where everything is different, and most of the rest of the story unfolds. That line is spoken at the moment that the movie jumps from monochrome to 3-strip Technicolor. Now, this was not the first in 1939 Technicolor movie, but color movies, especially full-length features, were very, very rare. And the audience was blown away by the psychedelic colors of Oz. And that arguably must be one of the reasons why the line that she happens to say at that moment when she steps out into the color movie has hung around with us in our collective consciousness all through these years. Okay, so, and then, the rest of the story arc of this movie, Dorothy is transported into this world that is completely different from everything that she has known. Nonetheless, she has to start making decisions right away, and she does. She meets with all kinds of hostility and opposition, but she builds a team throughout the story arc of the movie, and she ultimately triumphs. And in triumphing, noticing what she does is that she returns back to Kansas. Now, this is obviously an allegory that I'm going to make a little bit of use of during the rest of the presentation, including right here. Let's move on with the agenda. What is the critical first step in any emergency? Believe this or not, but the most vital first step when suffering an emergency is to recognize that this is an emergency. And that's what that line, where I don't think we're in Kansas anymore, is iconic of, is her moment of recognition that she's in Oz. Now, why am I stressing this? This is very often what goes wrong with us who aren't used to emergency conditions. This particular photo is from 2014. Here in Western New York, we had that phenomenal snowstorm that in some areas dropped up to 6 feet of snow, like inside of a day. That car in the photo That's over a ton of snow that is balanced on the top of that vehicle. And that vehicle is driving on a closed road. The roads were closed in order to speed the recovery of the roads. This person is, in hindsight now, actually doing something that's quite dangerous. They're not recognizing the gravity of the situation that they're in. The internet provides us all kinds of viral images of these instances. This happens a lot. For instance, here's a gentleman of which Oz, it looks like, is rapidly approaching, but he must finish mowing the lawn. Here are beachgoers in which danger is closing in very, very quickly, but they are still carrying on the beach. Why would you not recognize an emergency? Why am I stressing this from the outset? Okay, you would not maybe recognize an emergency because that's actually a very natural thing for us to do in cognition. It's known as normalization. Okay, so there's a threat, like on this slide, I have a shark, and say, which is obviously a threat, and say that you're in a swimming pool, and that's what you glance up and see. Your brain will first work very, very hard to make sense out of that. I think it's a miscarriage of something that otherwise is actually quite wonderful about us, is that we're very, very adaptive, and our brains will work to try to get something that's unusual suddenly in our environment to fit. And that's why we very often miscues that that's a very, very real danger that's closing in, and we need to stop what we're doing and do something else. Now, what just popped up on the slide is that I'm not the first person to look at the issue of normalization in cognition, and actually that's an article from the Harvard Business Review that is a very nice summary, actually, of a series of corporate disasters. Our organizations that we build have a tendency to do this just as we do as individuals, in which something befell a company that was very obviously coming, like the shark that's closing in, and yet in hindsight they did nothing about it because they kept coming up with explanations for all the anomalies that they saw approaching. Okay, so we just have to guard against this. This is human nature, but if we stay alert, we can guard against this. If we realize that we have been plunged into emergency, we recognize that it's an emergency. So what do we do then? What do we do next? Well, let go of your current plans, and that's not gonna feel good, right? But that is in the next link in success here, is that obviously you were interrupted when that anomaly popped up. Whatever you thought that you were going to be doing, okay, we're not doing that now. And as soon as we get over that fact, because we spent a lot of time on our plans, think of the beach goers, right? The better the rest of this is going to go. Because we're also going to need to change our decision rules now that we realize it's an emergency. And that's actually what the bulk of what I would like to share with you is about. We have to change how we operate when we realize that it's an emergency. Now, none of that sounds very pleasant, and it's not. So you have every right to ask, well, why? You're telling me it's an emergency. The first thing I have to do is abandon everything that I've been working on right now. I don't know about exactly abandon, but step back from. The reason is that your plans, it's not that they're wrong, but your plans that you made before an emergency, they were made based on the use of, you have control over your situation. You have control over your business, you have control over your environment, and you're a rational person. So your plans for what you were going to do next and what you were going to do next week and next month are all based on using that control in order to create beneficial outcomes. The problem is that once we realize that an emergency has popped up, we've lost at least some part of that control. That is what's happened. That's what disrupted conditions are. And the analogy that I like to use here is driving. So here we have an image where obviously the car that is nearest to us and another one down the road have skidded. Whoops. And I just moved in the wrong direction with the slides. When you move into disrupted conditions, the rules for steering change. And think about this as driving. Under normal conditions, you know how to drive a car, and you can drive your car wherever you want to go. What you're doing is you're interacting with the car. You are manipulating a variety of control systems. I mean, that's what they're called, the accelerator and the brake. Now, all of your control is based on, it depends on the traction, the grip that your tires are enjoying on the road. Once you start to skid, that condition's been caused by the fact that you've lost that traction. Typically there is ice or something on the road, like in this picture. And what you should best do next, notice how it's exactly the opposite of what you want to do under normal conditions. Once your car starts to move uninvited in an unexpected direction, you're skidding. What you want to do is stop the car, and your normal control mechanism is step on the brake. That's actually, under these conditions, the worst thing that you could do. You're supposed to remember, don't step on the brake. Steer into the direction that you did not ask to be going. But nonetheless, these are principles that are based on maintaining influence over the car until it gets grip on the road again. Well, in a broader sense, you don't have to be driving, right? If you're trying to achieve something and then you realize, like this pandemic, all of a sudden conditions have completely changed and you don't control a lot of what you're working with, you need to switch the rules that you normally work under. So that gets us to the principles for successfully managing during a disruption. I have a list here: revising objectives, cultivating options, planning in short cycles. These are principles actually from decision science. That's one way to describe my domain area as a professor. So I would like to go over those. The bottom two are important. They're enablers. It's not changing the way that you make decisions or the way that you make plans, but these are conditions that you should or could put into place that also help increase the likelihood of success under these uninvited types of slippery conditions. So let's look at the first change that you should make once you realize that you're not in Kansas anymore, once you realize that you're skidding, and what we want to do is steer out of the skid. Well, first off, let's look at normal decision making. Normally, what you do in decision making is you pick from a set of options. You plan, right? It says your planning phase, and a list of options has popped up. Fun fact, actually, that's what a decision is. A decision is a set of options. Okay, if you're in the planning phase under normal conditions, what you want to do is you're trying to select one of those options. As a matter of fact, you're trying to select the best option according to whatever your objectives are. Then, having done that, you will implement that. That's what it's meant by here, the production phase. You'll put that option into action, and that will last you out to the planning horizon. And that's, you know, how far ahead that you typically tend to plan and then work a plan. Okay, so we're going to focus on this right here, because under normal conditions, what are typical objectives that dictate which one of these options would be the best option? Well, very normally, rationally, what we're trying to do when we're picking an option is we're looking, for instance, to maximize efficiency or to minimize cost. Any of these options would work, but which one costs the least? Or we're trying to maximize profit. We're trying to maximize some type of benefit. That's what makes, you know, a selection a good selection or the best selection. Now, that's if we're in the planning phase. That's very often the goal that we're seeking. Once we move into, you know, what I was calling the production phase, which is to say we just try to put that into action, typically, you know, our objective is the on-time completion of the current plan. Once we've decided what we're going to do, are we on track to actually get that done? Now, all of this concerns optimization. I love optimization. I teach optimization. I'm in decision science. Optimization, the action of making the best or most effective use of a situation or resource. I teach methods for assessing large amounts of data and figuring out what the absolute best answer is. And then, aren't we so clever? We will put that answer into effect. Now, it's an emergency, we realize. I want you to drop that. We need to revise our objectives. It's actually a series of short goals. They're probably going to sound a little strange at first. Now, first, whatever you do, here's your objective. Now that you realize it's an emergency, whatever you decide, do no further harm. Now, where am I getting that? That is the principal first objective that is used in the training of people in emergency medicine, like emergency medical technicians and paramedics. They are taught, whatever you do no further harm. Now, why am I stressing that? What? Okay, I was just talking about the fact that I know it's tricky. We often refuse to recognize an emergency and we don't act on it, but we've pushed past that. Now we realize it's an emergency. Just don't be surprised by this. Once we realize it's an emergency, another very human reaction is we want to do something and we want to do it now. We are going to do something. Take a little bit of time though to make sure that this is the first step that you want to take. Sometimes we act too fast and we don't ask ourselves, are we actually just making this more complicated at the moment? So we just want that one check at the beginning. Then we go on to our next objective. What you need to be thinking about is not trying to maximize efficiency or minimize cost. It's whatever is going on right now. You want to contain it. You want to stop the damage. You want to try to stabilize the situation. This is your objective for the moment. Remember, this is temporary, because then we want to move on to figuring out how we repair or restore what just happened, because we're going to return to normal operation and we're going to return to these familiar objectives of always pursuing the lowest cost answer, right, or maximizing efficiency. We are going to go back to that, but for now, what we're looking at is, actually, this is a term we like in decision sciences, satisficing, not optimizing. Satisficing, I know that's not used a lot in conversation, but I think you can guess from what the root word is there, satisfy. If you're satisficing goals, you're just barely meeting them. As opposed to optimizing them, you're figuring out the absolute best way to do it. And it's long annoyed me as a professor and as a scholar of decision science that people who analyze like the underlying decision structure of emergency response, they very often notice, that the emergency decision makers, like incident commanders, they're not trying to optimize the solution. They're not trying to find the most efficient way to do something. They're simply satisficing. Okay, it's true, they are. And it's not because they're not sophisticated decision makers. It's because there's no such thing as optimal under emergency conditions. Okay, that's a thing from the normal world. There's no such thing as optimal in Oz. So don't stress yourself out about that. What you're doing is you're looking to satisfy this series of statements. Then we can go back to looking for the very best answers after we're back in Kansas. I mean, after everything's normal. I can prove this to you mathematically, just in case you're curious. I mean, this is from a study that I was a contributor to. And actually what that's referring to is something that, interestingly, we're living right now. And that's in our study, we were looking at successful decision makers in emergency response organizations. And we were noticing, even though they didn't call it that what they were practicing is known as lexicographic goal ordering. You're like, what? Well, what that means is that at any given moment during the emergency, they actually had two goals and one was subordinate to the other one. That shape on the page is made, it's meant to represent the solution that was found with the upper goal, the solution that was found first. It would be a solution that simply minimizes the deviation from acceptable. That is always the priority. And actually, we're living that right now here in New York State, because if you think about it, our scheme right now of phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 reopening of our economy, it's all based on monitoring the deviation from acceptable in hospitalization and new COVID cases. And given that there is movement on that front, we put a series of restrictions or release a series of restrictions in place that creates this space of which we then get on with our lives within that space. We try to work as efficiently as possible, given that the first objective has been met already. That's actually what emergency decision makers are doing. It's not that they're ignoring efficiency, but efficiency is second, right? Deviation from safety, from acceptable, from normal, minimizing that, that's what is decided first. So now that was all about objectives, right? How you picked from that list of options. Now let's visit, now that it's an emergency, let's revisit your list of options because it's not normal anymore. So I have a question for you. Are those really your only options? Because those options are from normal conditions, which means that generally, whatever they refer to, they've been vetted already. Generally, they represent different ways to do something, but they represent the best way under normal conditions to do these various things. There are other ways to do them, but we would never consider them because they're always more costly or they're always less efficient. But that's when things are normal. Have you ever wondered why flight attendants, when you get on a plane, are always pointing out the other exits? And the reason is if, very low probability, but if there is an actual genuine emergency aboard the aircraft, they want to plant this idea in your mind that actually you're thinking to get off the aircraft, there is only one option, and that's the door that was designed for that in the front, the big one that you came through. And they want you to remember that actually there's a bunch of doors on this aircraft. And yeah, you wouldn't normally use them. They're quite awkward and uncomfortable. But if it is an emergency, they're suddenly on the list and they may be the best option. Now, under cultivating options, really what you're doing is you are, during the emergency, rethinking everything that you have available, because there may be other uses, there may be stopgap ad hoc solutions that we can at least contain the damage with if we get creative. In this instance, the power of weak ties. Under cultivating options, remember your social network, because there may be people that you generally don't work with normally, but I mean, you know them or they're a contact on LinkedIn, that during an emergency, they might have something or be able to provide something that helps. And so they're part of this idea of deliberately broadening your option list. There's an interesting term in organizational science that's being batted around, bricolage. Bricolage is actually originally a term from fine arts. It refers to something like a sculpture that has been made from found materials. But what it's being used for now in a more general sense is solutions that are created from what happened to be at hand. This is, for example, an image of that, and this is in the wake of an earthquake at actually a large amount of housing. It was very quickly created from, these are freight containers, if you look, stackable freight containers that normally go on ships. This is an example of that. In the spirit of that, it is very interesting that there are a lot of commonalities between successful emergency response operations and creative operations. And I am not by any means the first person to notice that. This table, the first two columns actually refer to this book that you might enjoy, Artful Making, What Managers Need to Know About How Artists Work. And in this book, they point out through two parallel case studies how rapid software development, successful rapid software development, has a lot in common in terms of how to conduct that type of endeavor with theater. And this iterative cycle and unifying action, we're actually going to talk about that next because I added this column here. There are parallels also in emergency response, and the director and the forum for conversation down here. That's actually the last 2 points for my agenda. You would want to do this in order to succeed as well as you can during an emergency, but there's also kind of an imperative to remember to rethink your options during an emergency. This is the cover of an article that was in an MIT Sloan Management Review, and this article is a summary of a study of a variety of large-scale projects that ran into unexpected problems and didn't recover very well. And what they were looking for was explanations for why that happened. And one of the biggest explanations was that the projects were, it said, over-reliance on a single line of in-house tools, failure to use appropriate outside resources. Now, appropriate outside resources, now that this very large project like the opening of Terminal 5 at Heathrow Airport has run into unexpected problems, it was failure to broaden their option set then at that point to remedy that. Now, third thing in decision science, if you run into an emergency, you need to shorten your planning cycle. Because this is one stately planning cycle here that I have pictured under normal decision making. And what I'm talking about is down here, the idea that there's a distinct planning phase and a production phase. This is what's most familiar to us that work in the normal, right? We work in Kansas. We plan something, then we put it into action. That's what I mean by production. We do gather our experience there, feedback to inform the next cycle of planning, but there's always this lead time where we create a plan and then we put it into action. One of the fundamental challenges of working under disruption is you don't have that luxury. You will find yourself planning and acting at the same time. And this may at first seem very unfamiliar. Just don't try to map out your answers completely at any given moment. You will only stress yourself. Instead, do what fire departments do. Do what agile software developers do. Proceed by what's known as iterative planning. Okay, this may seem unfamiliar at first, but remember in your case, right, it is just for the duration of the emergency. You want to plan in many, many short steps. This, like I said, is actually, if you do have any familiarity with agile project management, this is actually a key principle of agile project management as well. You actually know quite a bit about this. So the idea is we get used to this idea of planning and production as being separable, and thus we get used to the idea of we're always working with organized materials because that's what we were doing under planning, was organizing them, and that acting, production, and success is always implementation of plans. Whereas there's a lot of conditions, including emergency conditions, in which the best thing is for these to be happening simultaneously, and that does mean, so it's a little disorienting, that you're often producing from what, from your perception, is disorganized materials because there wasn't time to get them organized. And your production is really most appropriately some form of invention or intervention, the solutions unfolding, which is why a lot of people call it trajectory-based planning. So think about it this way. If you get thrown into an emergency, what you're trying to do is find a path out, and you'll find it best step by step. That's the recommendation. And the reason that you have to take it step by step is because of what's known most generally as the fog of time. The military calls it the fog of war. It's the idea that at any given moment you want to make the best decision, but all of the information is not going to be available to you. Normal conditions look like this. You're planning to go someplace and you can see everything and you know exactly where you're going. When you're thrown into an emergency, it's visually the equivalent of this. This image is not totally unrelated to the first one, but notice that we can't see the shoreline anymore. We can't see the shoreline, so this idea of iterative decision making, it was described by one author as this is basically how you navigate when you don't know where you're going, right? And that's very often suddenly in an emergency. You at least don't know where you're going yet. This is actually one of the central tenets of the National Incident Management System that all emergency response organizations use in the United States. That is a publication of FEMA. And that's another diagram from a paper of mine. I can prove it to you why this is the best thing to do under emergency conditions, but I don't have to, because actually in my inbox this morning, somebody else spoke up about it. I got an email from UB Now, our newsletter, and there was this article, this was just this morning, about a colleague of mine in the School of Medicine, Dr. Dorscher. She volunteered for several weeks in Long Island in the pandemic at a clinic for people with substance abuse problems. And so the article was about that experience. And this was the quote that was highlighted in the margins of that article. Look at these two sentences. It was hard being the person that was being turned to for guidance and expertise in a situation where expertise simply does not exist. It's like building a plane while flying it and not being the pilot. Let's break this down. First off, she said it was hard. Yes, this is hard. This style of working is hard, especially if you are not used to it. But remember, if you, like me, are actually a citizen of Kansas and are used to normal, this is temporary, right? We just need to put effort into it. You can see how I like allegory in communicating things. I wish I had thought of this one. It was like building a plane while flying it. That's your simultaneity of planning and production, and not being the pilot. That's the loss. That's what's different between emergency conditions and normal conditions. Under normal conditions, we're used to being the pilot, right? We have some control over the situation. Emergency conditions, we don't. So now, all those concerned principles for decision making. Just really quickly, I wanted to touch on two other areas that do seem to be highly related to success in disordered environments. One is open channel for communication. Oh, sure, communication helps everything, right? But I'm talking about your team. Under emergency conditions, you want a way for your team to communicate with each other without everyone else's chatter getting mixed in. And a lot of times, if we rely on email, email fails us in that. And speaking of email, remember, under emergency conditions, if you're communicating, it is very important to be as brief as possible. And it doesn't have anything to do with being in a hurry. If you join a fire department, you have to learn how to talk on the radio, and you'll generally be given a couple golden rules for radio communications, and two of them will always be simplicity and brevity. It doesn't have anything to do with being in a hurry. It has to do with the fact that during emergencies, there's going to be a lot more messages, and everybody needs to conserve their mental bandwidth. So please, even if you have a full page of useful information to provide somebody else in an email, don't send the full page email. Write out all the useful information you can think of and send them the email. I've got your useful information. Here it is, right? The communication channel, you're just trying to keep as sparse as possible, because believe me, the emergency is going to clutter it for you. Oh, now, leadership and ritual politeness, two other things that enhance success under an emergency. Pick a leader in an emergency. Although this can be surprising, your leader doesn't have to decide everything and isn't even necessarily the same person throughout the incident. It just helps if somebody is in the lead at any given moment. Emergency response organizations for long emergencies don't require one person to be the chief of that emergency for the entire time. But what they do have is they have a very clear, explicit means of signaling to everybody when the leadership is changing. They can hand off the leadership at any given moment from one person to the next. So that's important, just everybody understands who's in the lead at that moment. This person's known in emergency response as the incident commander in the United States. This particular person It's known as the incident controller if you're in Britain or in Australia. I know you wouldn't call her the incident commander or the incident controller, but notice, if we're returning to the Wizard of Oz, that's what Dorothy was in the context of her team, is that she was the leader. She didn't strictly boss the other members of her team around as they searched for a solution to return her to Oz, but that's what she was distinctly providing the leadership in that scene. Now, let's look at the other half of that phrase at the top, ritual politeness. In an emergency, we can learn a lot from fire departments, from aviation, from movie crews that have to work under stressful conditions on locations that they don't control. In an emergency, remember to just make an extra effort to be calm and cheerful, because there'll be certainly a lot of things that are working against you here and working against being calm and cheerful. The reason for that is it's surprisingly practical. It's been shown in other studies that this demeanor of being calm and cheerful, known as ritual politeness, making a point of being that way, is a condition that helps create swift trust. Swift trust is what Dorothy achieved over the story arc of The Wizard of Oz. And if you think about it, she built a very effective team very quickly from individuals of which she had very little in common and hadn't ever worked with before, or didn't even know prior to this emergency that she was in. But I mean, that character, Dorothy Gale of Kansas, is now kind of a stereotype for being chipper and upbeat and kind. These things actually help the functioning of a team under very, very stressful conditions. So it's important not to lose sight of that. Now, even that particular point, and actually several other points, I am borrowing from other people's studies. I've been collecting these observations, people working on different dimensions of the problem of emergency response. So what this slide is that I just wanted to give some credit where credit is due. At this point, though, I'm at the bottom of my list of suggestions. I really wanted to thank you for listening, and then wondered, Christy, is there any questions?
Natalie, thank you so very much for sharing such a great presentation. We do have a couple of questions here that have been submitted, so I'll go ahead and start with the first one. So the first question, you mentioned, the pandemic that we're living in. So how can, this question submitted, how can I manage as an educator under the uncertainties and disruption and with interacting with students all at the same time?
Okay. One of the things, one of the principles actually at the beginning that's, when we were stepping into this, I said that this will be painful, but it is very important to step away from your normal plans. That's a key here. Managing, because I have found that. Managing as an educator, we know what is associated with excellence in our classes because we try to optimize the education that we're delivering every day under normal conditions. We are not normal conditions anymore. One of the first things that you should do, you still want to provide the best education possible, but think about simplifying. Under turbulent conditions, you're not going to be able to achieve everything exactly as it was when you were doing it in person, when the forces of the pandemic were not interfering with your ability to interact with your students. So try to simplify, take what you feel is the most critical and try to write. It's harder now under these disruptive conditions to get the message through. It's harder to meet the learning objectives. Pick the most important ones and mass your energy behind those. Don't try to chase everything. That's actually from my own personal experience. What I realized with my classes is there was just some really cool things that we were going to do in spring 2019. I had my heart set on. They were all interactive exercises in the classroom. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, how am I going to do this on Zoom? right? Or if I can't do this, oh no, what are we going to do? You know what? We're not going to do that. That can't be done under these conditions. But actually, then I started thinking about other options that, I mean, I normally in a teaching a live class would have no reason to use the breakout rooms in Zoom. It's a really interesting feature in Zoom is breakout rooms, and there just wouldn't be any reason to use them. But I started thinking about them now, and actually, I mean, it's not made everything all better, but I'm really glad that I did, because I got at least part of what I wanted back in my class. And again, it's by taking in options that they weren't on my list when I was first designing the class, because I didn't think we were going to be here doing this. I'm sorry, did that answer the question?
Yes, Natalie, thank you so much. The next question that we have here, how would you recommend socializing these concepts in an organization, especially if you're in a mid-level management role rather than an executive role?
One way is, it depends on the context, but don't discount the value of gaming. Actually, emergency response organizations, which are plunged into emergencies all the time, still do this anyway. They play tabletop games where you play your way through a scenario. This stepping through something, even when it's imaginary, has the power to familiarize your group, your team, right, your employees, without them actually experiencing the emergency. There is a benefit. I don't mean to invoke the pandemic, but it's kind of like a vaccine. It's a little bit of the dead virus that builds up their robustness if they're ever actually assaulted by the genuine disruption. It's the reason why, I know it's not a game, but it's the reason why the flight attendants point out the exits to you each time. It's true. We're not acting out an emergency. It's not an emergency. But just thinking through this and discussing it actually helps build up our robustness to it if it happens. It's like, well, we saw pictures of Oz, so when we're suddenly plunged into it, at least we recognize it really fast and we know what we need to do next. So training exercises like that.
Excellent. Thank you, Natalie. The next question, you mentioned a book earlier in your presentation. So this next question that's been submitted, do you have any other resources or books that you may recommend in regards to anything regards to disruption in organizations or emergency management?
Well, I started out sounding self-indulgent, and I guess that it's only natural. Then I'll conclude sounding self-indulgent. Oh, no, not yet, because I want to write a book on this. But there are lots of, actually that slide that I showed, some of those are academic papers, but some of those are articles in the Harvard Business Review and MIT Sloan's magazine. And those are excellent resources on the certain dimensions that I talked about. As far as a definitive single manual, like that's my dream. I think that's what we all need, is one manual that we can just put up on the shelf, but we can get down, in the event of an emergency and say, all right, well then, how should I be doing this exactly? I can point you at a lot of different things that will help. Not one single thing, unless you want to learn the National Incident Management System. That's actually a methodology for organizations to work their way through emergencies. You can download that free from FEMA. That's going to be framed very specifically in terms of abrupt, genuine emergencies, but a lot of the principles that I talked about were just broader generalizations of what is outlined in NIMS, the National Incident Management System. I really enjoyed that one book, Artful Making, and I recommend it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Natalie. I really appreciate it. Those look like they're all the questions at this time. So I want to say thank you so much on behalf of the Office of Alumni Engagement, on behalf of the UB School of Management. We're so grateful for your time, your knowledge, and your expertise. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have recorded this webinar just as a reminder. So we're going to send all participants the link within the next 24 hours. We'll also include this information, like I said, in the follow-up email in regards to today's webinar, and we'll also share with you a link to our archived webinars. We do have a library that you can go back to and watch any of the previous presentations that have been shared. We also want you to save the date for this coming Monday, June 8th. One of Natalie's colleagues in the School of Management, UB alumna Marianne Rogers and Clinical Associate Professor in the UB School of Management's Organization and Human Resources Department, will be joining us. And she's going to talk a little bit more about understanding workplace emotional culture. So we'll send you this information too in the follow-up email, and you can register at that point or view the link on our website or in an email that we'll be communicating to all alumni this coming Sunday. So more information, just keep an eye out into your email box for that to come your way. In addition, I want to take just a couple of minutes to turn it over to Natalie for any closing remarks.
Right. Christy, you didn't say I had to compose closing remarks. I delivered all my best lines.
You were fabulous.
In closing, I'd like to say any one single thing, I word underscore is, actually, I saw this phrase just recently, self-compassion. If you don't normally work under emergency conditions, and most of us don't, all of this that I was talking about that are the keys to success will seem really unfamiliar. Be patient with yourself. You can do it. And actually, you may even emerge a stronger person. I'm not like trying to put a gloss, on bad times. I'm serious, because it's all a learning process, but be patient with yourself. It's very natural that this doesn't seem familiar, but you'll get the hang of it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Natalie. Thank you so much for everyone joining us today. We hope you have a wonderful weekend. Take care of yourself, stay well, and we hope to see you on Monday's webinar or a future webinar coming up in the next week or two. So thank you again. Thanks, Natalie. Everyone, enjoy your weekend.
Oh, you're very welcome.